Hello everyone, and thank you very much for joining NextLabs and SAP for our webinar titled Roles, and More Roles. What is right for you? My name is Tiffany and I am happy to host this webinar. I am proud to introduce today's speakers, Florin Stolbrink and EK Ko. Florin has a master's degree in computer science and has spent more than 20 years in the IT industry. He joined SAP in May 2000 as a consultant and has been working as SAP project manager for international organizations. His current role in SAP is business development manager for SAP Security Services. He is focusing on SAP authorizations as well as identity and access management. EK is the VP of Solution Management at NextLabs. He is responsible for NextLabs' industry-focused solution offerings and works closely with the industry experts and customers to leverage NextLab products to address problems such as export control compliance and secure supply chain collaboration. I would now like to turn the presentation over to Florin.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. My name is Florian Stolbrink. Let me switch to the agenda. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about business drivers and common challenges in sub-role design. I will also give a short overview about the different types of SAP roles. After that, EK is going to talk about dynamic authorizations. He will explain to you how an attribute-based role concept can help you to overcome these challenges in SAP roles and authorizations. At the end, I'm going to present some customer examples where the classic SAP role design and authorization concept is not sufficient to fulfill the customer requirements. After that, I'm going to hand over to EK again, and we'll have time for your questions. A lot of customers that I talk to face a problem of how to manage their SAP roles properly. There are several reasons for this. Number one is globalization. Companies are expanding their business to new countries like Saudi Arabia or regions like Asia. Or they expand the collaboration for business processes to new subsidiaries or partners. Reason number two is anywhere, any device. Employees require access to company-sensitive data on their mobile devices. How to control the intellectual property on these devices? Cyber attacks to mobile devices are common and difficult to control. Challenge number three is the industrial consolidation. The globalization leads to a higher rate of mergers and acquisitions, partnerships, and joint ventures. What are the security and compliance challenges that arise with the global collaboration? The collaboration between partners or companies require access to internal IT systems quite often. This leads to risk of losing the control about the intellectual property of your company. The same applies for cross-border access. Employees in new countries get access to sensitive data. Legal regulations might require the limitation of access to certain information. Handling the IT access and data security under these circumstances leads to high efforts and costs. Or, from my experience, it might be even impossible to manage these within SAP standard functionality. The number of access variables rise with the complexity of the regulations, rules, or policies. In a classic role-based access control model like SAP roles, This leads to an explosion of the number of roles. This is shown in the graph on this slide. With the number of access variables, the number of required access rules or roles explode. A few words about SAP roles. There are two types of SAP PFCG roles. Number one, single roles that contains a menu and the authorizations including the values. This is a classic type of SAP roles. Number two is composite roles. This is a combination of single roles. There are several subtypes of single roles that help to manage and structure access roles. Functional roles are used in combination with value or enabler roles. Functional roles contain the authorization objects for the functional access only, where the value or enabler roles contain the authorization objects for organizational differentiation only. A combination of both of them make then the access properly for user. The concept of a master role and derived roles is similar, but the derived role contains all authorization objects plus the organizational values. In this case, derived roles are assigned to users and provide the required access. As mentioned before, quite often this leads to a very high number of derived roles that needs to be managed, and in some cases it is impossible to be managed. Let's look into the number of resources that are required for different types of access control. On an application, a service, or a functional level, the typical number of resources can still be managed, what you can see on these numbers here. But once you try to manage the access on the data type, it becomes very difficult. If you try to manage the access on a document or data object level, it becomes even impossible with the classic role-based access control model. Let me show you one example. Let us assume that there are 10 types of project memberships, PR01, PR02, and so on, and a flag of citizenship, in this case for US. Then access should be limited to 5 different locations, like US, China, UK, Germany, or Brazil. 5 different export licenses need to be considered in the authorization concept. There are 5 levels of NDA and 4 types of data usage like view, copy, change, and send. If you combine all of this, this leads to 10,000 combinations already. Imagine 10,000 combinations. And I can imagine that most of you have requirements that are even much more complex than what we see here in numbers. Referring to a study from 2010, 56% of the participants think that there is a lack of standardization in their roles across the different applications. There's an average of 9 applications per user, 17 roles per user, and 35 administrative actions per role. This leads to an average cost for user adoption of about $240 US. With a company with 10,000 users, this means a lifetime cost of $40 million US, referring to the study. Imagine this cost. So, EK, please go ahead and, well, talk about how dynamic authorizations can help to overcome these problems.
Thank you, Florian, and once again, thank you all for attending this morning's webinar. So as Florian highlighted, there are many different ways of managing roles within SAP, but in the context of the trends and market, dynamics that he discussed, there's a rising complexity in our data access requirements, and that sometimes requires us to consider other ways to manage our authorization. And here I'm going to talk about the concept of dynamic authorization and attribute-based access control. So we're going to start with just a concept, right, which we call authorization dimensions. I think if you look at some of our authorization requirements, they fall into three big categories. One is what we call functional access requirements, right? So these are requirements, your authorization requirements that determine the actions or the transactions a user can perform. And then there are data access requirements, and these are the authorizations that determine what kind of data or information a user can in fact see, even if he have the rights to execute a certain transaction, right? And then there is a third dimension, which is just the rules, we call governance rules, that govern who can assign what access and who can authorize what access, right? So in general, if you look at a set of authorization requirements, you can usually break them into three different sets of rules. So here's an example, right? Of engineering, authorization set of engineering authorization requirements, right? So the first three rules is design engineers can create, edit, and view drawings and bill of materials. Engineering services can create change orders. Engineering managers and engineering services can view drawings, bill of materials, and change orders, right? So these are examples of functional authorizations. You are saying what each engineer can in fact do, right? Create, edit, or view drawings, okay? So these set of rules determine the transactions an engineer can have. The next set of rules are what we call data authorization requirements, right? So for example, right, rule number 4 says internal users can access all company product data. Suppliers can only see their own product data, and partner company can only work on program X data, right? So these are examples of rules that govern the kind of information each user can in fact see. And then the next two, rules 7 and 8 says external partner accounts must be approved by partner manager. Only trade compliance can classify new materials, right? So these are governance rules, right? So what we recommend, right, in order to simplify your rising authorization requirements and challenges, is to in fact break and segment your authorization requirements into each of these three buckets. Then you can select different tools to in fact govern the authorization for each of these different layers, right? So for example, you can first govern based on functional authorization, right? So given a user and who he is, you can decide what transactions he can first run. And that could best be done using existing SAP authorization concepts, right, such as the different kind of role-based management capabilities that Florian has just highlighted. Now, once it's determined that a user has access to a certain transaction, say view material master, then depending on what materials he wants to look at, you can apply a second authorization to that request. And that's what we call the data authorization layer, right? We can now determine that, hey, you are looking at material 100-1, and based on that classification of the material, you are not allowed to look at it, even though you have access to that transaction. Or similarly, you might be authorized to look at it because you have certain security clearance, or you had obtained certain export license, for example, that will allow you to look at that particular material, right? So by separating the two different layers, they allow you to use different authorization tools and different authorization concepts for each of those layers, right? Now, so what would be the right set of tools, right? Florian talked about functional roles, derived roles, enabler roles, and now we want to introduce the concept of attribute-based access control. Right now, what you use would really depend on your requirements, right? So we like to look at it in two different, dimensions, right? 2 by 2, if you will, right? On the vertical axis, we look at your ecosystem complexity, right? Do you collaborate mainly just within limited geographies, right? Maybe only within your corporate office. Maybe you just have one office and everybody's in the same place. Or are you a global organization, right? And you collaborate globally, but mostly within your own organization, right? In which case, the SAP's organization, units and values can in fact be used as a way to control and manage roles. Or are you collaborating globally with external parties, right, through your multi-level supply chain? Now, if you do that, then your SAP's organizational roles and in units is not going to map very well to those external people, right? So that's one dimension, is your ecosystem complexity, right? What kind of people are you, in fact, collaborating with? And then on the horizontal axis, we look at your authorization complexity, right? Do you only require functional control, right? You do not have very complex data access requirements, for example, right? That will put you on the left corner. Or perhaps you have very complex data authorization requirements, right? Because of some of the trends that Florian talked about in terms of globalization, in terms of access anywhere, and in terms of mergers and acquisitions, and that is, making it very dynamic for you. The users who need access to information could, be changing all the time, for example, and that leads to a lot of complex authorization requirements. Now, what we recommend customers do is that if you are in the left quadrant, right, where you are collaborating mostly within your own organization, and you just want to use that to manage, your authorization requirements, and in many cases, existing SAP roles, concepts are in fact well suited for that, right? You can use enabler roles, for example, to map your roles to different organizational units. However, once you are collaborating outside the organization with your supply chain, with your contractors, and your data requirements now become a lot more complex, then attribute-based access control, or what we call dynamic authorization, will be much better. Otherwise, you will lead to what we call row explosion, right? Which is a graph that Florian had shown you earlier, right? The challenge I think we see with most companies, right, is that in fact data access complexity is increasing, right? They are no longer, in the left quadrant, right, based on the kind of information that they want to manage, right? And there's a couple of reasons. One is that people are using SAP, keeping more sensitive information within SAP, right? There's a significant amount of trade secrets and intellectual property, such as contracts, pricing, recipes, product specifications, and sensitive CAD designs that are being kept within your SAP, PLM, ERP system itself. There is more collaboration, right, with your customers, right? Everybody's trying to expand globally. There is more collaboration with your suppliers, with your manufacturing, partners in Asia, for example. And that's requiring a lot of what we call external, extended supply chain access. And then, of course, as you expand globally, right, you are now more subject to different rules within different countries, right? You might be subject to export control rules for the countries you operate in and for the countries you sell to. And many of these export rules will require you to manage access to what they call technical data. or you could be, subject to data privacy rules as you operate in each country. They might have privacy requirements that dictate certain information needs to stay in country, right? And then you have your own intellectual property protection requirements, right? As more and more people, as you work with more and more partners, right, and you're sharing more information with these partners and supply chain, you want to have better control over who can see what information as they access SAP. So here's an example, right? It's an example of what a company's role requirement would look like, right? So we can start with a company that collaborates mostly internally, right? And here's an enterprise that has 5 subsidiaries. So there's 5 company codes, right? And there are 50 functional roles. So these functional roles could be procurement, could be IT, engineering, product manager, so on and so forth, right? So there are 50, functional roles, 5 subsidiaries, and each of these subsidiaries have 7 plants, right? And each of these 7 plants have 10 storage locations. Now, if you were to use derived roles to try to replicate that structure, right, depending on which subsidiary a user is in, what functional role he's in, what plant he works in, what storage location he might need access to. Just that math, right, if you do that math, it will lead to almost 19,500 rows, right? So as Florian pointed out, using derived rows can very quickly become fairly complex, right? And now to maintain these 19,000 rows can be very, very challenging, right? You could, of course, use enabler roles, right? And since this company is largely collaborating within the enterprise, you can use the OU structures within SAP to do that role management. And if you use enabler roles, right, with 5 subsidiaries, 7 plants, and 10 storage locations, you lead to about 400 plus rows, right? And these 400 plus rows is really 50 functional rows, 3 enabler role templates, right, based on company, plant, and storage locations, and then about 350, enabler row value pairs, right? So for a total of about 400 plus rows or rows-related attributes that you have to manage, right? So you can see that if you are collaborating within the enterprise, using enabler roles can be quite helpful. However, I think enabler roles is not always sufficient, right? There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that enabler roles are best suited for access based on organizational units, right? So if you have access that is based on your supply chain, then it becomes a bit of a challenge because those users don't map nicely into your organizational units, or you end up creating virtual organizational units just to accommodate them, right? And bear in mind that the more of these virtual organizational units that you do, it makes changes and additions much more difficult, right? It is also not suitable for complex data authorization requirements, right? Because you might be forced to create additional organizational units to manage those requirements. And if your access is dependent on dynamic factors, such as the location in which the user is requiring access, or perhaps the type of device that he is using to access the information, or the time of day, those dynamic input, what we call attributes, cannot be mapped into your organizational structure, right? And certainly, if you are wanting to create roles that cut across enterprises, enterprise applications, roles that not just apply to SAP, but also to your other, say, Microsoft, SharePoint, or other PRM systems, then it will not, the concept enabler roles does not carry across those applications, right? In that case, an externalized approach would be required. So while enabler roles is great for many, companies, especially if all they need is to collaborate within the organization, it cannot meet all your requirements, right? So what would be the right approach, right? As we show in that 2x2, right? We want to introduce the idea of dynamic attribute-based authorization, and in fact, this is a concept that many analysts have started to propose. Just the beginning of the year, Gartner predicts that by 2014, in their 2014 prediction, they predicted that by 2020, 70% of all businesses will use attribute-based access control as the dominant mechanism to protect critical assets, right? Up from 5% today, right? So today, the concept is still fairly new, but Gartner is projecting that by 2020, most organizations will be using that, right? And similarly, a leading analyst in Europe, Carpenter, recommends dynamic authorization as part of a complete access governance framework, right? Including provisioning and privileged access users management, right? Carpenter, just like Gartner, believes that that is the way to go. And quite recently, the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technologies, right, the standards body that recommends what the U.S. government and its agencies use, and it's very often followed closely by the industry, recommends the use of attribute-based access control as the means to protect access to data, right? And that those recommendations come because companies recognize that their data access complexity is increasing and that they have a greater and greater need to collaborate outside of the organization, which puts them in the top right quadrant of the 2x2 that I've shown you earlier. So let me now, spend a couple of slides to talk a little bit about attribute-based access control, or what we call dynamic attribute-based authorization. Right. So the concept here is that authorization, access to data, needs to be or can be dependent on multiple attributes, not just the role of the user. So the role is just one attribute, but it can be any number of attributes. Right? And very often these attributes fall into three big buckets. Right? The first big bucket is what we call the identity of the user. Right? So who is the user? What's the role of the user? Which plan does he work with? What is his skill set certification? What is his security clearance? What is his nationality? Those are example attributes that are related to the identity of the user. All right? So the role of the user being just one of those attributes, right? And then another class of attributes would be what we call context attributes, right? Contextual attributes, right? So these could be things that change, or with each access, right? It could be which computer are you using to access? Is it a corporate computer or is it your home computer? What location are you trying to get the information, right? Because in this day and age, people expect access from their mobile devices, and they can be anywhere, when they travel, trying to access this information, right? So what location is he accessing from, what device, what time of day? These are things that change, right? That's why we want the authorization to be done dynamically at the time of request, right? And depending on those factors, your policy could say, well, if he's on a mobile device, don't show him that information. But if he's on a corporate device within business hours, then go ahead and show him the information, right? So you can have that fine-grained, control that is done in real time, right? And the third bucket of attributes would be what we call content-based attributes, right? So these would very often be the classification of the data. So what data type are you looking at? Is this a recipe? Is this a bill of material? Is this a CAD file? And what is the classification of the data you're looking at? Is it considered trade secret? Is it considered, a program X data? So a lot of customers we talk to now want to go to program-based security, right? It is not just broad classifications, right, at a corporate level, whether this is a trade secret or secret or restricted, but they want to classify by program and project as well. And so that adds a lot more complexity to the kind of data access requirements that companies now have. So the idea of attribute-based access control is that you can govern access to data based on multiple attributes, and these attributes will be determined at runtime. Right? So here's an example of a policy, right? That's what we call attribute-based policy, right? So this policy is somewhat English-like, right? But it says allow only U.S. engineers to access Project X specifications from U.S. offices. Right? So here's an example of policy. And what this policy, if you drill down, right, the concept of U.S. engineers is comprised of multiple attributes, right? So a U.S. engineer could be defined as a user with a location attribute equals to U.S. and a department attribute equals to engineering. And these attributes could exist within your SAP's user directory, or it could exist, say, in your Active Directory, in your enterprise, or in some LDAP directory or database. Right? So that's one class of attribute called, U.S. engineers. Then you have another class of attributes here called Project X specification. Right? So if you drill down on that, it probably refers to any data that has an attribute called project, and that value is set to project X. And maybe there's another attribute called type of data, and it's set to specification. Right? And so once again, where do you get these attributes? These attributes could be maintained within, SAP itself, right? Or it could be part of the metadata that's embedded, say, within your Office document, right? That we could use to determine access, right? And the third, component here is the U.S. offices, right? So here is if you drill down on that, could mean anybody accessing from certain network addresses that is pre-approved, right, as corporate addresses, right? So here's an example of a policy that governs multiple attributes that specifically pinpoints who can access what kind of data from what location. Right? So if you use attributes like these, then in our last example, right, where you have an enterprise with 5 subsidiaries, 7 plants in each subsidiary, and 10 storage locations, right? As we say, if you use derived rows, it will result in almost 19,000 rows. If you use enabler rows, it will be about 400. If you use functional rows and ABAC policies, right, you will have 50 functional rows and 1 attribute-based access control policy, right? That policy will probably have 3 data attributes, one trying to match with your company code, the other with your plant location, and the third on your storage location, right? So, but the interesting thing to see is what happens if we expand these to cover project-based security and authorization requirements, right? So suppose now you say, okay, I'm going to do project-based authorization, right? I have 100 different programs within my organization, right? And I want to govern access based on who is in which program, in addition to which subsidiary, which plant, and which location he works in. Right? If you do that, then very quickly derived rows become unmanageable, right? Because now you have 1.7 million rows. And even with enabler rows, you have close to 35,000, right? Because of the enabler row value pairs now that you now have to manage for each of those combinations. But with attribute-based access control, right? You will still have 50 functional rows, 1 policy and 4 data attributes. And if you choose to, you can have a couple more policies, but that would be pretty much what is required. Right? So you can see that as things get more complex, the idea of attribute-based access control is more sustainable, it's more scalable, and more manageable. And with that, I'm going to hand back over to Florian, where he will walk through you a couple of use cases where dynamic authorization would be well suited. Florian, back to you.
Thank you very much, EK. Yes, well, I'm talking to many customers in my life as a consultant, and I have here some examples of use cases where, well, there have been challenges with the role concept, and some of these could not even be fulfilled in SAP standard. And well, some of these questions or challenges might be familiar to what you meet in your companies. First example is from a customer in the defense industry. The challenge or the objective was that the business is expanding to new countries, to non-NATO countries, but even the regulations within NATO countries or between NATO countries for data protection gave them a challenge of setting up their ERP system landscape and ERP authorization concept. Actually, SAP was not able to fulfill the requirement for data protection in a way that they could set up a single instance in their SAP environment, and they were thinking about having country-specific instances for each country. And you can imagine what this would mean for maintenance of the system, cost of system operations, and so on. Another thing was that they were not only having data in their ERP systems that they want to protect and are classified, but also on non-SAP systems like file shares, collaboration tools, and even systems that are not standard at all, but are developed by their own. And the solution approach, what we did was that we could fulfill the security settings beyond the SAP authorization model. So on, for example, access type and so on. So attributes like EK has shown before on the rule that has been created. So we created rules, and with these rules there could be additional authorization checks in SAP, and with these rules we could fulfill the required authorization checks that are not available at all in SAP standard. Second thing was, well, with to achieve this within SAP, you would have, of course, a chance to do this by custom development or by SAP custom development enhancements. With your own development or custom development, you easily run out of SAP standard maintenance because you do changes to SAP, or you need to do changes to SAP standard code. And with SAP custom development project, you would have huge costs. And with the NextLabs solution, you would have a standard solution. It would be an add-on to the SAP system, and with this add-on, you would also have the maintenance and maintenance of a software provider like NextLabs, which is an SAP partner. With this approach, we could go for an architecture with a single instance, and as mentioned before, avoid a cost for additional systems. Also nice about the solution is that it covers SAP and non-SAP applications. So we were able to show that with one instance of the NextLabs solution and the rule engine and so on, that was able to do the authorization checks in real time for SAP and non-SAP applications. And real time really meant that it was in milliseconds. So it hasn't caused any sizing issues or so in the landscape. Yeah, I think that's most important for this case. Second case is from service industry, and service industry customer came to us and said, well, I have some data that is confidential and not all my people in the purchasing department should see this. So it should be limited to very few people in my global organization. But limiting data across an SAP system on an object, on a single object level, like a purchase order number or yeah, something like a contract number or so, well, it's not possible because there are no authorization checks for that. And well, we did this study, and one would be again, or one solution would be again to have custom development, like always, or a CDP project. And well, this would have meant yeah, a lot of costs. So the implementation efforts and costs, so even that we are looking to a very small number of transactions and actually very few data that need to be protected, we were with a project cost about $500,000 US. And so imagine what this would mean then to extend this to even more processes and so on. Yeah. As we look to the third customer, it's automotive industry, and well, we talked about merger acquisition, organizational changes, and so before. And in a global company, well, you can imagine there's a lot of changes in the organization. There are several reasons for this. So one is merger acquisition, some is well, others are whatever, legal changes, changes to the organization for better efficiency and so on. And the problem with this is once you change the organization and have a role model with derived roles, with probably 1,000, 10,000 of roles, of derived roles, you always have to adopt these changes of the organization also to your role model. And imagine that you add new organizations, delete organizations, change the structure of the organizations. You always have to change the roles. And you cannot do this in a day or two. You have to test this, you have to, yeah, transport this in your landscape and so on. And this means always a delay of the availability of the new roles and the new authorization concept, so that it can be even assigned to a user. So imagine that an organizational change becomes active, and that it takes, even if you're fast, it takes a week or two to adopt these changes to your role model, and then the people have to wait for a week or two to access their financial data. So, well, you probably need a system that has an attribute-based access control model, and with this model, you would maintain your changes of the organizational structure to some system. Probably you have it in the HR system, you have it in some other systems, you probably have it in your LDAP, wherever. And the authorization checks can immediately be based on these changes to the organization. So these are just three examples of customers where an attribute-based access model could help them to reduce costs, yeah, immediately, and also help them to work much more efficient. Well, back to you, EK.
Thank you, Florian. And so I I think through this webinar, you hopefully would understand now the choices that you have. I think there's a very rich set of role management capabilities within the SAP tool chest, right? But as Florian pointed out, there are increasing data access complexity requirements. People are wanting to collaborate more outside the organization, and the three examples that Florian showed you are good examples of those kind of use cases where you can and you should be thinking about using dynamic authorization instead. And at this point, I'd like to just pause and just introduce NextLabs. This webinar is co-hosted by NextLabs and SAP. We appreciate Florian taking his time to co-present with us. And SAP, of course, needs no introduction. NextLabs, we are an SAP endorsed business solution partner. We provide policy-driven information risk management software for some of the largest companies in the world, and we help them achieve safer and more secure internal and external collaboration. And now I am going to move to Q&A, and we will take the questions as they come in. You can type your questions in the Q&A panel within your web client. So please feel free to enter your questions. So the first question is, how does this work in GRC and how SOD issues are addressed? So this is a very good question, right? When you say GRC, I assume you mean GRC access control, right? So a lot of customers use GRC access control to manage the life cycle of a role. They also use it to ensure that SOD issues are resolved, so roles do not have conflicts, right, with regards to the transactions that they are allowed to have. Right? Now, dynamic authorization complements GRC access control. Right? It works together with GRC access control. Right? It does not replace. Right? So what happens is customers should continue to use your GRC access control to manage the life cycle of the role, and then that role becomes an attribute that can be used in the policy that we use to determine access. Right? And in fact, there are other attributes within GRC access control in addition to roles. If you have custom attributes, those could also be used and be provided as attributes for policy decision making. Okay. So that's how we work with GRC. Now the next question here is, how is this solution related to technical data compliance solution? I assume you mean export control. So the technical data compliance solution, and NextLabs has a solution called SAP Technical Data Export Compliance. I assume you might be referring to that. That solution is built on top of this, right? Underlying the technical data export compliance solution, we leverage dynamic authorization and attribute-based policies. So technical data compliance will come with a set of prepackaged policies that would allow you to control access to technical data and depending on the location of the user and the availability of export licenses, for example. Okay, so those are solutions built on top of what we just discussed today. Okay, and the next question here is, we don't have consolidated identity management systems to maintain all the user details. How does dynamic authorization work in that case? Florian, I'd like to defer that question to you.
Okay, thank you. Well, yeah, as we are dealing with attributes, there should be a source for these attributes. But the source for these attributes does not necessarily have to be an identity management system. The source of these attributes could be also an HR system, could be by IP address, which is stored in the device itself. It could be, Active Directory, which probably any one of you is using. So an identity management is one source for this type of information, and it's probably a system where most of this information is stored, if you have one. But if not, there should be a lot of other systems which can be integrated into this solution as a source for this type of data.
Thanks, Florian. So the next question here is, will using attribute-based access control require me to re-engineer all my roles? So Florian, I'd like to defer that to you as well, because I know you probably have been asked that question many times.
Yeah, that's true. Well, you have seen the different types of roles already, and depending on which model you're currently using, you probably have hundreds or thousands or 10,000 of derived roles, and you don't necessarily have to redesign your role concept at the beginning. It might be useful to come to a functional role model, what you have seen, if you remember the table that EK has shown on the very right-hand side, this columns where you have just a handful of functional roles. That would be very easy to design based on your existing role model. So it would be more to delete or deactivate some of your existing roles and creating a full new role model. So the efforts would be, even that you might have some need to do some adaptations, might be very limited. So to the question, do I have to do that? Probably yes. The efforts will be very low.
Very good, Florian. Thank you for taking that question. And with that, we have come to the end of our webinar. And for any questions that we were not able to take, we will answer them via email. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Tiffany for the wrap-up.
Thank you, Florian and EK, for a great presentation. Before we end today's call, I would like to encourage all of you to reach out to Ruth Stevens to request a copy of our white paper on SAP Dynamic Authorization, or schedule a meeting with Ruth to find out about our SAP-endorsed business solution for information risk management, or contact Ruth to schedule a demo. We will be sending out the recording of this webinar in the next week or so, so please watch out for it. Again, thank you for joining us today. We hope the session has been informative for you. This concludes our NextLabs and SAP webinar. Bye-bye now.